The alarm blares through the hospital speakers as billionaire Victor Reeves watches his son's tiny body convulse on the bed. Theo's lips turn blue, monitors scream. Time slows to a cruel crawl. 48 hours ago, they were celebrating Theo's 5th birthday. Now, doctors are fighting to keep him alive for just one more night. "Get out of my way!" Victor roars as medical staff push him back from the bed. His net worth exceeds $17 billion, but in this moment, he's just a father watching his child die. The autism diagnosis 3 years ago had been challenging enough. Then came today's bombshell. A rare metabolic disorder destroying Theo's nervous system. Terminal. Aggressive. Unstoppable. 3 months, the specialist had whispered. Maybe less. The same hands that signed billion-dollar contracts now tremble uncontrollably as nurses rush past with crash carts. Victor's wife Elise crumples against the wall, her silent scream more devastating than any sound he's ever heard. This can't be happening. For a man who conquered Wall Street at 27, the words, "nothing we can do," are unacceptable. Victor had already called in favors from Switzerland to Singapore, offered $100 million to anyone who could save his son. But money, the solution to every problem he'd ever faced, had suddenly become worthless paper. Theo's body goes limp as the doctors work. 1 second passes. 2, 3. A faint beep returns to the monitor. "We've stabilized him," the doctor announces, her face grim. "But the deterioration is accelerating. I'm sorry, but you should start preparing." Later that night, Victor stands alone in Theo's bedroom at their Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by toys that may never be played with again. His fingers trace the solar system mobile hanging above the empty bed. Planets spinning in perfect order while his world collapses into chaos. The cruelest irony? Victor's fortune came from revolutionizing diagnostic medical technology. He'd saved countless lives, just not the one that mattered most. His phone buzzes. The home care agency. They've sent profiles for a caregiver to make Theo comfortable during his final months. Victor hurls the phone against the wall, watching it shatter like his hopes. Making someone comfortable means you've already given up. What Victor doesn't know yet, what 17 specialists across 4 continents have missed, is that salvation isn't waiting in some cutting-edge research lab or experimental treatment facility. It's about to walk through his front door in worn-out shoes, carrying ancient wisdom modern medicine has forgotten. And what happens in the next 89 days will defy everything science thought possible. Have you ever wondered what you would sacrifice to save your child's life? Would you trade your entire fortune, your reputation, or even your deepest beliefs? Drop a love emoji if this story has already hit you in the chest, because the miracle that's about to unfold changed medicine forever, and not a single doctor saw it coming. Long before Victor Reeves became a household name, he was just a skinny kid from Akron with a beat-up laptop and an obsession with medical diagnostics. While other tech entrepreneurs chased social media and gaming fortunes, Victor focused on something more vital: detecting disease before symptoms appeared. At 23, he mortgaged everything to launch Previo Medical, developing a blood test that could identify pancreatic cancer months earlier than existing methods. Venture capitalists laughed him out of conference rooms. Too niche, they said. No market potential. 6 months later, when the Mayo Clinic validated his technology, those same investors called begging for meetings. Victor remembered every rejection. He took funding from a single investor who believed from day one, expanded into other early detection systems, and by 35, Previo Medical's IPO made Victor worth $4.2 billion. He's not building a company, he's starting a revolution, Forbes declared on their cover, featuring Victor's intense gaze and characteristic black turtleneck. For a man who could diagnose diseases before they showed symptoms, romance proved more elusive. Victor cycled through relationships with models and executives, each ending when his 18-hour workdays inevitably took priority, until Elise Harmon walked into a charity gala in a midnight blue dress and changed everything. Unlike the others, Elise, a brilliant neurologist with her own research breakthroughs, matched Victor's intensity. When she called him out for checking email during their first dinner date, he canceled 3 meetings to take her sailing the following weekend. 16 months later, they married on his private island. "Elise makes me remember why I'm saving lives in the first place," Victor told Time magazine in a rare personal interview. When they decided to start a family, both assumed it would happen as efficiently as their other achievements. Instead, they endured 3 miscarriages. Specialists found nothing wrong. Victor, the man who'd revolutionized diagnostics, couldn't diagnose why his wife kept losing pregnancies. For the first time, money couldn't solve his problem. Victor donated $50 million to fertility research, built a reproductive health wing at Boston Memorial, flew in specialists from Israel to Switzerland, all futile gestures. "It nearly broke us," Elise confessed to Victor one night after their 3rd loss. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be controlled, even by people like us." When they finally succeeded with their 4th pregnancy, Victor spared no expense. He converted an entire floor of their Manhattan penthouse into a medical suite, hired 3 OB-GYNs to monitor Elise around the clock, designed an emergency protocol that included a helicopter standing by on the roof. The pregnancy remained precarious. At 30 weeks, Elise developed preeclampsia, so severe doctors performed an emergency C-section. Theo Reeves entered the world weighing just 3 pounds. His tiny body whisked immediately to the NICU. "He's a fighter," the neonatologist assured them, "small but strong." For 67 days, Victor and Elise lived at the hospital, watching their son grow stronger behind glass walls. When they finally brought him home, Victor's security team included 2 pediatric nurses and a neonatologist. By his 1st birthday, Theo seemed to be developing normally. Then the milestones started slipping. No first words, limited eye contact, repetitive movements. At 18 months, a developmental pediatrician delivered the first diagnosis: autism spectrum disorder. "Many children with autism lead full, exceptional lives," the specialist explained, sliding brochures across her desk. "Early intervention is key." Victor and Elise attacked this challenge like every other, systematically and with unlimited resources. They established the Reeves Center for Neurodevelopmental Research, recruited the world's top ABA therapists, designed sensory-friendly spaces throughout their homes. For a while, it seemed enough. Then came the unexplained seizures, the muscle weakness, the metabolic abnormalities that appeared in routine blood work. "Something else is happening," Elise insisted, her medical training heightening her concern. The carousel of specialists began anew. Geneticists sequenced Theo's entire genome. Neurologists ordered increasingly sophisticated brain scans. Metabolic experts tested for hundreds of rare disorders. The diagnosis, when it finally came, felt like a physical blow. Mitochondrial neurometabolic cascade disorder. So rare, only 11 cases had been documented worldwide. The prognosis was brutal: progressive deterioration, systems shut down, death within months. "There must be something," Victor insisted, pounding his fist on the specialist's desk. The next 8 weeks became a desperate global hunt. Victor chartered jets to research hospitals across 4 continents, offered blank checks to pharmaceutical companies for experimental treatments, even explored fringe therapies rejected by mainstream medicine. Nothing worked. Theo's condition deteriorated more rapidly than predicted. The mighty Victor Reeves, the man whose technology had saved millions, couldn't save his own son. His empire continued expanding, stock prices soaring, while at home, his world imploded. Dark circles carved permanent shadows beneath his eyes. His legendary focus shattered. At night, Victor would sit beside Theo's bed, watching his son's chest rise and fall, wondering how many breaths remained. Elise retreated into research, searching medical journals until dawn, her physician's knowledge a curse that let her understand exactly what was happening to their child's body. Their marriage, once the envy of the business world, frayed under the strain. They move through their palatial home like ghosts, united only in their devastation. "We need help," Elise finally admitted, her voice hollow. "Someone to care for Theo while we—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "While we prepare to lose him." Victor nodded, surrendering to the inevitable. Their vast wealth, power, and connections had proven worthless against this invisible enemy. The household manager would arrange for a caregiver, someone to make Theo comfortable during his final months. Money couldn't solve this problem, but someone unexpected was about to walk through their door and change everything they thought they knew about healing, hope, and where true wisdom resides. The May morning dawned crisp and clear as Zara Okafor stepped off the subway at 77th Street, clutching a worn leather portfolio against her chest. The gleaming residential towers of the Upper East Side loomed overhead, worlds away from her cramped Bronx apartment. At 28, Zara wasn't where she'd planned to be. Medical school had been the dream, until her grandmother's cancer drained their modest savings and left Zara with student loans, but no degree. She checked the address again, though she'd memorized it days ago. 740 Park Avenue, penthouse. The Reeves residence. Even in Nigeria, where she'd spent her early childhood, everyone knew Victor Reeves's name. The doorman eyed her skeptically as she approached. "Delivery entrance is around back." "I'm here for an interview," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "With Mrs. Reeves." 5 security checkpoints and 1 elevator ride later, Zara stepped into a foyer larger than her entire apartment. A stern-faced woman in a tailored suit approached. "Miss Okafor? I'm Helen Morris, the Reeves household manager. The agency sent your credentials, but they seem incomplete." Her gaze flicked dismissively over Zara's simple navy dress, carefully selected as her most professional outfit. "You have limited experience with special needs children." 3 years at Bright Horizons working with neurodivergent preschoolers, Zara countered. "And I helped care for my cousin who has cerebral palsy." Helen's expression remained doubtful. "This position is considerably more complex. The child has multiple medical conditions requiring specialized care. Mrs. Reeves insisted on interviewing you personally, but I should warn you." "Helen, is that the last candidate?" Elise Reeves appeared in the doorway, thinner than her magazine photos suggested, with exhaustion etched into her elegant features. Despite this, she moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "Miss Okafor, thank you for coming. Please, follow me." As they walked through the penthouse, Zara glimpsed museum-quality artwork, furniture she recognized from design magazines, and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing a breathtaking panorama of Central Park. But she also noticed something odd: medical equipment partially concealed behind custom cabinetry, emergency protocols discreetly posted, and the faint antiseptic smell beneath expensive room fragrance. "This isn't a typical childcare position," Elise began once they were seated in a sunlit study. "Our son Theo is 5. He has autism spectrum disorder and a rare metabolic condition." Her composed facade cracked slightly. "His prognosis is limited." "I understand," Zara said quietly. "The agency mentioned his health was fragile." "That's putting it mildly," came a deep voice from the doorway. Victor Reeves stood there, imposing in person despite his rumpled appearance. His piercing gaze assessed Zara with the intensity of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions in seconds. "Miss Okafor was just explaining her qualifications," Elise said. "I reviewed her file," Victor replied, not taking his eyes off Zara. 3 semesters of pre-med before dropping out. No nursing credentials. No specialized training in metabolic disorders. His tone wasn't cruel, merely factual. "We've had world-renowned specialists fail to help our son. What exactly do you think you can offer?" The question hung in the air. Most candidates would have wilted under his scrutiny, but Zara straightened her shoulders. "Connection," she answered simply. Medicine isn't just about credentials. Sometimes it's about seeing the person, not just the symptoms. Victor scoffed. We need medical expertise, not philosophy. Let's introduce her to Theo, Elise interjected, a note of steel beneath her diplomatic tone. That's the true test, isn't it? The boys' room was a marvel of thoughtful design, sensory-friendly lighting, sound-dampening walls, and equipment that blended seamlessly with cheerful decor. In the center, a small figure sat cross-legged on a playmat, meticulously arranging colored blocks in patterns only he understood. Theo, sweetheart, Elise said softly. There's someone here to meet you. The boy didn't look up. His hands moved with surprising dexterity despite the slight tremor Zara noticed, one of the symptoms of his condition, she guessed. Rather than forcing an introduction, Zara knelt several feet away and observed silently. After a moment, she reached for a blue block that had rolled aside and placed it exactly 6 inches from Theo's pattern. Victor started to interrupt, but Elise touched his arm, shaking her head slightly. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, without looking up, Theo extended his hand and incorporated Zara's block into his design. He doesn't usually accept outside contributions, Elise whispered, astonishment in her voice. Zara noticed the pattern emerging. Not random as it first appeared, but a sophisticated color sequence with mathematical precision. She selected a yellow block next, placing it at the exact distance where Theo could reach it without disrupting his concentration. Again, he incorporated it. My grandmother would say he has old eyes, Zara murmured. What does that mean? Victor demanded. In my grandmother's village, they believed some children see the world differently because they're carrying ancient wisdom. Zara smiled slightly at Theo. She was a traditional healer, what you might call an herbalist or folk doctor. She taught me to observe before acting, to look for patterns others miss. Victor's expression hardened. We need science, not superstition. With respect, Mr. Reeves, Zara replied, her eyes still on Theo. My grandmother combined traditional knowledge with modern understanding. She sent 37 children to medical school, including me, at least part way. For the first time, she looked directly at Victor. She taught me that healing comes from many sources, and that sometimes the most important symptoms are the ones nobody else is watching for. Something in her steady gaze made Victor pause. We've tried everything, Elise said, her voice breaking. Experimental treatments, clinical trials, specialists from around the world. Sometimes the answer isn't in looking harder, Zara replied gently, but in looking differently. As if sensing the emotional current in the room, Theo suddenly stopped arranging blocks. His small hand reached out, not toward his parents, but toward Zara. His fingers lightly touched her wrist, the briefest connection, but in a child who rarely initiated contact, it felt monumental. He's chosen, Elise whispered, tears welling. Victor remained silent, conflict evident on his face. Later that afternoon, against Helen's strenuous objections and Victor's lingering doubts, Zara Okafor was hired as Theo Reeves's caregiver. She would move into the staff quarters the following morning. This is temporary, Victor clarified as he signed the employment contract. A trial period only. Zara nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. Nothing about this job was truly long-term. Not with Theo's prognosis. As she rode the elevator down, clutching her new security badge, Zara felt the weight of what she'd taken on. These people had tried everything money could buy. What could she possibly offer that Harvard-educated specialists couldn't? She thought of her grandmother's words. The eyes cannot see what the mind doesn't know to look for. What Zara noticed in her first week would challenge everything the specialists had missed for years, and put her on a collision course with a medical establishment that had already written Theo's death sentence. Zara's first days in the Reeves household felt like navigating a luxury hospital. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, nurses checking vitals, a physical therapist conducting morning exercises, a nutritionist preparing specialized meals. Everyone had been there longer, knew more, and regarded her with thinly veiled skepticism. Theo's routine is precise, Helen explained, handing Zara a 3-inch binder. Any deviation triggers distress, which exacerbates his condition. Follow the protocol exactly. The binder contained minute-by-minute schedules, medication timetables, and emergency procedures. What it lacked, Zara noticed, was any record of Theo's daily experiences, his reactions, preferences, patterns. That first night, after Theo finally fell asleep, Zara started a journal, not clinical notes like the nurses kept, but observations about Theo himself. Day 1. Theo arranges blocks by prime number sequences, avoids red objects, rubs left ear before distress episodes, pupils dilate 30 seconds before physical symptoms appear. By her 3rd day, the journal had grown to 15 pages. While other staff focused on managing Theo's condition, Zara watched the boy behind the diagnosis. She noticed how his tremors worsened after certain meals, how his speech, limited to begin with, disappeared completely for hours after taking his medications. During her brief overlap with the night nurse, Zara attempted to share her observations. "With respect," the nurse replied, barely glancing up from her charting, "I've worked with terminal pediatric cases for 20 years. These are classic progression symptoms, not reactions." Undeterred, Zara expanded her documentation. She created a timeline correlating Theo's meals with his symptom flare-ups. She noted which fabrics seemed to trigger his skin sensitivity. She logged the household cleaning products used in different rooms. On her 5th day, Zara discovered something odd. While helping Theo with lunch, a specially prepared organic meal delivered by a service catering to children with dietary restrictions, she noticed his immediate physical response: dilated pupils, increased hand tremors, ear rubbing. Later, when snacking on apple slices prepared in the regular kitchen rather than from the medical meal service, Theo showed none of these reactions. That night, Zara flipped through photos on her phone, images she'd discreetly taken of ingredients lists and meal components. She compared them against her observation journal, plotting reaction intensity against specific foods. A pattern emerged, not from the exotic ingredients the nutritionist had eliminated, but from something basic, something so common it was in nearly everything. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Sometimes the poison is not what is added, but what is already there. The next morning, Zara approached Dr. Phillips, Theo's primary physician, who visited the penthouse daily. "Excuse me, doctor. I've noticed a pattern in Theo's reactions that might—" "Ms. Okafor," he interrupted, not looking up from his tablet. "Please leave the medical assessments to the medical team. But if you could just look at these observations—" "Doctor," Phillips sighed, finally meeting her eyes, "your enthusiasm is commendable, but this child has been evaluated by the top specialists in the world. His condition is deteriorating according to the expected progression. False hope is cruel." Heat rose in Zara's cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "It's not hope I'm offering, doctor. It's data." He handed back her journal without opening it. "Focus on keeping him comfortable. That's your job." That afternoon, when Elise came to read to Theo, Zara gathered her courage. "Mrs. Reeves, I've been tracking Theo's reactions to different foods, and I've noticed—" "Ms. Okafor," Helen interrupted, appearing as if from nowhere. "Mrs. Reeves doesn't need to be bothered with day-to-day care details." Elise looked between them, fatigue evident in her posture. "It's fine, Helen. What have you noticed, Zara?" Before Zara could answer, Theo began to seize. The room erupted into practiced emergency response. Helen calling for the nurse, Elise cradling her son's head, medication administered with terrifying efficiency. Later, after Theo had been stabilized and sedated, Victor appeared in the doorway of Zara's small staff room. His face was haggard, eyes bloodshot. Helen tells me you've been experimenting with Theo's care routine. Zara stood, clutching her journal. Not experimenting, Mr. Reeves. Observing. My son doesn't have time for amateur diagnostics. His voice was dangerously quiet. Every minute we waste on unproven theories is a minute stolen from his remaining time. With respect, sir, I believe something in his specialized meals may be triggering his metabolic crashes. If you would just... Enough. The word sliced through the air. We hired you to provide comfort care, not to play detective. If you can't accept that role, we'll find someone who can. After he left, Zara sat on the edge of her bed, journal open in her lap. The data was clear to her. Theo's worst episodes correlated precisely with his medical-grade nutrition. But without medical credentials or even a completed degree, who would listen? For 2 days, Zara continued her documentation while outwardly conforming to protocols. She researched late into the night, comparing her observations with case studies of similar metabolic disorders. Then, she found it. A 2023 paper documenting a child with symptoms remarkably similar to Theo's, who improved after removing a common additive from their diet. The paper had been dismissed by mainstream medicine, but the biochemistry aligned perfectly with Theo's reactions. On her 8th day, Zara made a decision that could cost her job. Theo's lunch arrived from the specialty service: organic chicken, vegetables, and rice. The ingredients were pristine, but Zara suspected the problem wasn't in the food itself, but in the medical-grade formula mixed into every meal to support his metabolic needs. She prepared an alternative lunch using regular food from the family kitchen, carefully matching the appearance of his usual meal. When Helen stepped out to take a call, Zara switched the plates. Theo ate without protest. Zara watched, heart pounding, monitoring for any reaction. None came. For the first time since she'd arrived, his tremors didn't intensify after eating. His eyes remained clear. No ear rubbing, no distress signals. That evening, when Victor and Elise came to say goodnight to their son, they found something unexpected. Theo was sitting up in bed, arranging his blocks with steadier hands than they'd seen in weeks. He seems better tonight, Elise whispered, afraid to hope. Zara took a deep breath. There's something I need to show you both. In the adjacent sitting room, she laid out her journal, the research paper, and her timeline correlating Theo's meals with his symptoms. I believe Theo isn't dying from an untreatable metabolic disorder, she said, her voice firm despite her racing heart. I think he's being poisoned by the very supplements prescribed to help him. The silence that followed was deafening. That's absurd, Victor finally said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Today I gave him regular food without the medical formula. His symptoms improved within hours. Zara pointed to her charts. His worst episodes always occur after consuming the highest concentrations of this supplement. Dr. Phillips prescribed that formula, Elise said. It's specifically designed for mitochondrial support. Yes, and for most children, it probably helps. But Theo's specific genetic makeup might be turning a key ingredient toxic. Zara pulled out the research paper. This study documents a nearly identical case. A child diagnosed with terminal mitochondrial disease who actually had a rare reaction to synthetic vitamin compounds. When removed from their diet, they didn't just stabilize, they improved. Victor paced the room, conflict evident on his face. If what you're saying is true, it means the very treatment prescribed to help him is accelerating his decline, Zara finished. And it means his condition might not be terminal at all. This is dangerous speculation, Helen said from the doorway where she'd been listening. Dr. Phillips should be consulted immediately. Doctor, Phillips dismissed my observations without even looking at them, Zara countered. With respect, Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, we don't have time for medical egos. I'm not asking you to believe me without proof. I'm asking for a controlled test, 3 days without the supplements. If I'm wrong, we've lost nothing. if I'm right. She let the implications hang in the air. You could lose your medical license for this, Victor said, turning to his wife. I gave up practicing 3 years ago to focus on Theo, Elise replied softly. Then, with sudden resolve, and I don't care about licenses if there's even a chance to save our son. Victor stared at the journal, at the meticulous documentation made by a woman with no credentials, but with eyes that had seen what specialists missed. 3 days, he finally agreed. But if his condition worsens even slightly, we revert to the established protocol immediately. Zara nodded, relief washing over her. Thank you for listening. Have you ever known something was wrong but couldn't get anyone to listen? When your gut screams the truth but everyone dismisses you? Drop a comment in the comments box if you've been there, because what happened next in this true story changed medical history. And it all started with someone brave enough to trust their observations over authority. Dr. Samuel Phillips arrived at the Reeves penthouse at 7:30 a.m. sharp, as he had every morning since Theo's diagnosis. The Harvard-educated physician had built his reputation treating the children of Manhattan's elite. His waiting list stretched 2 years, unless your name was Reeves. He found Victor and Elise waiting in the study rather than Theo's room. Unusual. Is everything all right? He asked, setting down his medical bag. We'd like to discuss a temporary adjustment to Theo's protocol. Elise began carefully. Doctor. Phillips raised an eyebrow. What sort of adjustment? Victor slid Zara's journal across the table. His caregiver has observed some correlations between his supplement regimen and symptom flares. The doctor didn't touch the notebook. You mean the caregiver with no medical training? His laugh was short, dismissive. Mr. Reeves, with respect, this is why we separate medical decisions from emotional caregiving. Just review her observations, Victor insisted, an edge to his voice. With visible reluctance, Doctor. Phillips flipped through the journal, his expression growing increasingly incredulous. This is absurd, he finally declared, closing it with a snap. These supplements are specifically formulated for mitochondrial support. They're the gold standard for his condition. But what if, in Theo's specific case, they're causing harm? Elise pressed. Doctor? Phillips removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. Mrs. Reeves, I understand grasping for hope, but this borders on magical thinking. This, he tapped the journal contemptuously, is the equivalent of a medieval villager suggesting bloodletting causes weakness. We've witnessed improvement since removing the supplements, Victor countered. Coincidence, or worse, the placebo effect. You're seeing what you want to see. Doctor, Phillips leaned forward. We have diagnostics, empirical evidence, 11 documented cases with identical progression. Your son's condition is terminal. False hope only steals precious time from properly managing his comfort. Victor's jaw tightened. We're requesting a 3-day trial without the supplements. As your physician, I strongly advise against this. In fact, Doctor. Phillips straightened, his tone shifting to one of professional formality. I cannot in good conscience continue as Theo's doctor if you pursue this course. It violates medical ethics. The threat hung in the air. Finding another specialist of Phillips's caliber willing to take a terminal case would be nearly impossible. Then consider yourself relieved of duty, Elise said quietly. Doctor, Phillips stared at her in disbelief before gathering his things. At the door, he paused. I'll have my office transfer his records to whoever you choose as his next physician. For Theo's sake, I hope you reconsider this dangerous path. After he left, Victor paced the room. Maybe he's right. We're risking Theo's care based on the observations of a... He caught himself. A what, Victor? Elise challenged. An uneducated maid? Is that what you were going to say? Victor had the grace to look ashamed. Someone without medical credentials, he amended. You built your first diagnostic prototype in a garage with no formal engineering training, Elise reminded him. Would you have wanted established experts dismissing you without examining your data? Before Victor could respond, Helen appeared in the doorway. Sir, Dr. Abernathy from the Mitochondrial Research Center is on the line. Dr. Phillips contacted him about Theo's case. The call was brief and devastating. Dr. Abernathy, who had never examined Theo personally but had consulted on his case, expressed grave concerns about the Reeves' decision. He hinted that if they pursued unproven interventions, the research center might need to reconsider the experimental treatment slot reserved for Theo. By afternoon, 5 specialists had called to express concerns. 2 had directly accused Zara of manipulating vulnerable parents. 1 had gently suggested psychiatric evaluation for both Victor and Elise to address denial in the terminal care process. They're closing ranks, Victor observed grimly after the last call. Zara sat quietly through the barrage, her composure intact despite the personal attacks on her character and intelligence. Only the whiteness of her knuckles as she clutched her journal betrayed her tension. Perhaps we should reconsider, Victor finally said. The medical community is protecting its authority, Elise finished, and its liability. Later that evening, after Victor retreated to his office to make calls seeking a new primary physician, Elise found Zara in the kitchen, preparing Theo's dinner. Regular food, carefully selected based on her observations of what he tolerated best. Don't lose heart, Elise said softly, checking that they were alone. Victor believes in data above all else. Keep documenting everything. The medical establishment is powerful, Zara replied, her voice low. And I'm just— Don't you dare finish that sentence, Elise interrupted. My husband built his fortune challenging medical orthodoxy with his diagnostic technology. He's forgotten that now, but I haven't. She slipped a key card into Zara's pocket. This accesses Victor's private research library. Use it tonight after everyone's asleep. There's information there about Theo's specific genetic sequencing that even the specialists haven't fully analyzed. Why are you trusting me? Zara asked. Elise's eyes filled with tears. Because yesterday, my son spoke 3 complete sentences for the first time in months. Because his hands stopped shaking long enough to build a tower taller than he has in weeks. And because despite his supposed terminal diagnosis, his eyes were clearer than I've seen since this nightmare began. Over the next 48 hours, the household fractured into opposing camps. The medical staff, loyal to Dr. Phillips, documented their objections while performing minimal duties. Helen maintained a frigid professionalism toward Zara, monitoring her interactions with Theo for any misstep. Victor oscillated between hope when observing Theo's improvements and doubt when facing the unified opposition of medical experts. He avoided direct interaction with Zara, speaking about never to her during staff meetings. Only Elise remained steadfast, running interference between Zara and the resistant staff, secretly providing access to test results and research, and most importantly, giving Zara precious time alone with Theo to continue her observations. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fragile truce shattered. Victor received a call from the head of neurology at Boston Memorial, a longtime colleague who spoke with patronizing concern about the dangerous path the Reeves family had taken. Minutes later, Child Protective Services called, responding to an anonymous report alleging medical neglect of a terminal minor. Victor exploded, storming through the penthouse until he found Zara in Theo's room. "This has gone too far," he thundered. "We're facing potential legal action because of your unproven theories." Behind him, Theo startled at the sudden noise, then did something that stopped Victor mid-sentence. What happened next would force Victor to question everything he thought he knew about medicine, wealth, and who really deserves to be heard. Dawn broke over Manhattan as Theo's screams shattered the pre-morning silence. Zara reached him first, finding the boy rigid in his bed, back arched in agony. His eyes, which had been clearer the past 2 days, now rolled backward, showing only whites. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. "Help!" she shouted, activating the emergency response system. Within seconds, the room filled. Nurses, the remaining medical staff, Helen directing traffic with practiced efficiency. Victor and Elise burst in wearing rumpled sleepwear, terror etched across their faces. "What happened?" Victor demanded, watching helplessly as the night nurse administered emergency medication. "Massive seizure activity," the nurse reported clinically. "Worse than previous episodes." Helen turned to Victor, her expression vindicated despite the crisis. "This is exactly what Dr. Phillips warned would happen if we disrupted his protocol." Victor's face hardened as he turned to Zara. "Get out! Sir, please, get out!" The words exploded from him, raw with fear and rage. "You've done enough damage." As Zara backed toward the door, Elise caught her wrist. "Wait." Her voice, though quiet, carried unexpected authority. "Zara, what do you think is happening?" The medical staff exchanged incredulous glances. Victor stared at his wife in disbelief. "Elise, now is not the time." "It's exactly the time," she countered, not taking her eyes off Zara. "Before we rush back to a treatment protocol that was already failing him." Zara looked at Theo, now mercifully unconscious from the emergency medication, but still trembling intermittently. She took a deep breath. "This isn't regression," she said firmly. "It's withdrawal." The tension in the room shifted from emergency response to open hostility. "This is absurd," Helen snapped. "He's not a drug addict." "Not from drugs," Zara clarified, "but from the synthetic compounds in his supplements." She moved to her small bag in the corner, pulling out her journal and a stack of research papers. "I've been in Mr. Reeves's research library for the past 2 nights. I cross-referenced Theo's genetic sequencing with recent studies on mitochondrial metabolism." Victor's eyes widened. "You did what?" Zara plowed ahead, knowing this was her only chance. The particular formulation in Theo's medical supplements contains a synthetic form of coenzyme Q10 that most people process normally. But according to his genetic profile, Theo has a rare variant in the gene that metabolizes this compound. She spread papers across the foot of Theo's bed, printouts of genetic maps, biochemical pathways, and case studies. Instead of supporting his mitochondria, the synthetic compound accumulates in his system, gradually poisoning his cells. When we removed it, his body began purging the toxin. What you're seeing now isn't his disease progressing. It's his body fighting to heal. "Convenient theory," the nurse said dismissively. "But Dr. Phillips never ran the specific genetic panel that would have shown this interaction," Zara interrupted. "It's too new. The research was published just 6 months ago." She handed a journal article to Victor. This study from Johns Hopkins identified 17 children previously diagnosed with terminal mitochondrial disorders who were actually suffering from toxic accumulation of synthetic supplements. 15 showed improvement when the compounds were removed and replaced with naturally sourced alternatives. Victor scanned the paper, his scientific mind engaging despite his emotional turmoil. "Even if what you're saying is true," Helen interjected, "you had no right to experiment on a child without medical supervision." "She wasn't alone," Elise said quietly. "I authorized it." Victor looked up from the paper, stunned. "You knew about this?" "I suspected she was right," Elise admitted. "I've watched our son deteriorate for months while following expert advice. Then, for the first time since his diagnosis, he improved. I couldn't ignore that." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of Theo's monitors. "The withdrawal period is approximately 72 hours, Zara continued, her voice steadier now. "His body is purging the accumulated toxins. It's violent but necessary. If we reintroduce the supplements now, we'll suppress these symptoms temporarily, but continue poisoning him long-term." She met Victor's gaze directly. You built your company on the principle that early detection saves lives. This is early detection of a deadly interaction that established medicine missed. The difference is that this time, the patient is your son. Victor's face revealed the war within him, a lifetime of deference to medical authority, battling against the undeniable data before him and his own pioneering spirit. "What do you propose?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. Helen gasped. "Mr. Reeves, you can't seriously—" "What do you propose?" he repeated, louder, not taking his eyes off Zara. "Support him through the withdrawal. Replace the synthetic supplements with natural alternatives I've identified. Monitor for improvement." Zara's voice gained strength with each word. "I believe his condition isn't terminal at all. It's iatrogenic. Doctor caused. And if I'm right, he won't just stabilize. He'll recover." The nurse stepped forward. "Sir, as the senior medical professional present, I must formally object. This constitutes experimental treatment without proper protocols." "Noted," Victor said flatly. He walked to his son's bedside, gently brushing sweat-soaked hair from Theo's forehead. For several moments, he stood in silence, the weight of the decision visible in every line of his body. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I've spent my life believing that credentials and expertise were everything. I built a company that revolutionized diagnostics. I've funded research centers, endowed chairs at medical schools, testified before Congress about the importance of scientific rigor." He turned to face the room, his expression transformed by a father's anguish. "And none of it saved my son. The best minds in medicine told me to prepare for his death." Victor's gaze settled on Zara, the unqualified caregiver who had dared to challenge the medical establishment. "How long will the withdrawal symptoms last?" "Another day, possibly 2, she answered. "They'll be intense but shouldn't be life-threatening if managed properly." "And if you're wrong?" Zara met his gaze unflinchingly. "Then we haven't shortened what was already a death sentence. But if I'm right, you get your son back." Victor nodded once, decision made. "Do what you need to do." Would you trust someone without credentials if your child's life was at stake? When established experts say one thing, but your instincts tell you something else? Comment yes or no below, because what you do in this moment might reveal more about your character than you realize. The next 72 hours in the Reeves penthouse unfolded like a medical thriller. Victor converted Theo's bedroom into a specialized care unit, complete with monitoring equipment that transmitted real-time data to the research team he'd assembled overnight. "Natural source coenzyme Q10, Zara instructed as she reviewed the treatment protocol with Victor and the reluctant but professionally obligated medical staff. "Not the synthetic form, and we need to add high-dose folinic acid, specifically leucovorin, not synthetic folic acid." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Leucovorin? That's a chemotherapy support drug." "Yes, but research from Dr. Richard Fry's team showed it can cross the blood-brain barrier through an alternate pathway," Zara explained, sliding a research paper toward him. "Some children with autism have autoantibodies that block normal folate transport. This bypasses the blockage." The hastily assembled medical team, professionals willing to defy conventional wisdom under ironclad confidentiality agreements, moved with precise efficiency. An intravenous delivered fluids and electrolytes to support Theo through the withdrawal. Blood samples went hourly to the lab Victor had commandeered at his company headquarters. Through it all, Theo suffered. His small body shook with tremors. Sweat soaked through sheets that required changing every few hours. Occasionally, he'd cry out in a voice so raw it seemed torn from his soul. Zara never left his side. "How much longer?" Victor asked on the evening of the second day, his voice ragged from lack of sleep. "His labs are showing decreased toxin levels," Zara replied, studying the latest results. "The worst should be over by morning." Elise, who had been sitting motionless beside Theo's bed for hours, finally spoke. "How did you know?" "About the leucovorin. about the synthetic versus natural supplements. All of it? Zara's eyes remained on Theo as she adjusted his cooling blanket. My grandmother would say I listened to what his body was telling us. She smiled faintly. But the scientist in me, even an incomplete one, recognized patterns in his symptoms that matched emerging research. She pointed to a folder containing dozens of articles, case studies of children diagnosed with rare neurological disorders who actually had treatable metabolic issues, papers on cerebral folate deficiency and autism, research on synthetic additives triggering cascade effects in children with certain genetic variants. But how did you find these connections when specialists couldn't? Victor pressed. Because they were looking for what they expected to see, Zara answered simply. They were specialists in mitochondrial disease, so they saw mitochondrial disease. I had no preconceptions, just observations. Dawn broke on the third day with no change in Theo's condition. The medical team exchanged worried glances. Helen's expression grew increasingly smug. Even Elise's steadfast faith wavered, her hand trembling as she stroked her son's hair. Only Zara remained calm. His body is still fighting, she insisted, pointing to subtle changes in his latest lab work. The toxin levels are nearly undetectable now. He just needs time. By noon, the household had settled into a tense vigil. Victor paced the hallway outside, fielding calls from board members concerned about his extended absence. Elise dozed fitfully in a chair beside the bed, and Zara continued her methodical care, applying cool compresses, administering the natural supplement protocol, documenting every minute change. At 2:17 p.m. it happened. Theo's eyes fluttered open, clear and focused in a way they hadn't been for months. "Water," he whispered. One word. So ordinary under normal circumstances, but in this room, after months of minimal verbal communication, it felt seismic. Zara's hand froze on his forehead. "Theo?" His eyes tracked to her face. Recognition flickered there. "Water, please," he repeated, his voice stronger. Zara's hands shook as she held the straw to his lips. "Elise?" she called softly, not wanting to startle either mother or child. "He's awake." What followed was a moment that would be forever etched in the memories of everyone present. Elise's disbelieving gasp, her desperate lunge toward the bed, the sob that tore from her throat when Theo's eyes focused on her face and he said, clearly, "Mommy, why are you crying?" The next hours brought a cascade of small miracles. Theo's tremors subsided completely. His fever broke. Blood tests showed dramatic improvements in markers that had been deteriorating for months. By evening, he was sitting up, asking for his favorite book. Victor stood in the doorway, watching his son interact with Elise and Zara, his expression a complex mixture of joy, disbelief, and lingering scientific skepticism. "This can't be explained by removing one compound," he murmured when Zara joined him later. "The improvement is too dramatic. Too sudden." It wasn't just one thing, Zara explained, opening her journal to diagrams she'd created. Think of it as a cascade effect, but in reverse. The synthetic CoQ10 was the primary toxin, yes, but it triggered inflammatory responses throughout his system. That inflammation created a folate transport problem, which further impaired mitochondrial function, which exacerbated his autism symptoms. She flipped to another page showing interconnected pathways. By removing the trigger and simultaneously supporting the damaged systems, natural CoQ10 for mitochondrial support, leucovorin to bypass the folate blockage, specific amino acids to repair cellular damage, we didn't just stop the poisoning. We created the conditions for healing. As days turned into weeks, Theo's improvement continued at a pace that astonished even Zara. The tremors never returned. His speech, while still showing signs of autism, flowed more freely each day. Most remarkably, his neurological scans showed decreasing inflammation and improved metabolic function throughout his brain. "It's similar to a case published last year," Zara explained, during a conference call with specialists who had initially dismissed her theory, but now clamored for information. A child diagnosed with terminal mitochondrial dysfunction was actually suffering from a treatable metabolic reaction. Once the triggering compounds were removed, his body began to heal itself. Victor arranged for comprehensive documentation of Theo's case. Blood samples, tissue analyses, genetic sequencing, and detailed records of his treatment protocol were compiled with scientific rigor. The medical implications are staggering, noted Dr. Eleanor Zhang, a leading mitochondrial researcher who'd flown in from Stanford to review the case. How many children have been misdiagnosed? How many terminal cases might actually be treatable interactions? 1 month after beginning Zara's protocol, Theo joined his parents for dinner at the main table for the first time in nearly a year. Though still sensitive to certain sounds and lights, his autism remained a part of who he was. His movements were coordinated, his speech increasingly fluid. "The brain has remarkable plasticity, Doctor," Zhang observed, watching Theo carefully arrange his food before eating. Once we removed the compound that was essentially poisoning him, his natural development began to reassert itself. For the Reeves family, the transformation felt nothing short of miraculous. For the medical establishment, it presented a paradigm-shifting case study that challenged foundational assumptions about treating complex neurological conditions. But the real miracle wasn't just Theo's recovery. It was what happened next. 3 months after beginning Zara's protocol, Theo Reeves built a perfect replica of the Empire State Building with his blocks, 86 stories, with a miniature King Kong clinging to the spire. His hands, once plagued by constant tremors, worked with remarkable precision. The boy who doctors had given 3 months to live was now planning his 6th birthday party. "I want a dinosaur cake," he informed Zara one afternoon, his speech clear despite the slight pattern of repetition typical of his autism. "A T-Rex cake, with green frosting. Green frosting, please." Zara nodded, making a note in what had evolved from a symptom journal into a celebration of milestones. "Green T-Rex cake. Got it." From the doorway, Victor watched this exchange, still sometimes struck by disbelief. The transformation wasn't just in Theo's physical health, though that alone defied medical explanation. It was in the small, ordinary moments that had once seemed impossible. His son asking for a birthday cake, playing with other children during carefully arranged playdates, sleeping through the night without medical intervention. Independent verification had confirmed what Zara discovered. Genetic testing centers across the country were now screening for the specific variant that had turned standard treatment into poison for Theo. 3 other children previously diagnosed with terminal conditions had already been identified with the same interaction and had begun similar protocols. "Mr. Reeves?" Zara's voice pulled Victor from his thoughts. "Theo wants to show you something." Victor entered the playroom where his son sat surrounded by papers covered in numbers. "Dad, look." Theo held up a sheet filled with complex mathematical equations, far beyond first-grade level. "I figured it out." Victor knelt beside him, examining the work with growing amazement. "Theo, this is calculus." "It's easy," Theo replied matter-of-factly. "The numbers make patterns." Later that evening, after Theo had gone to bed, Victor found himself alone in his study, staring at his son's equations pinned to the wall beside framed accolades from his own career. Honorary doctorates, the cover of Fortune magazine, presidential commendations for his company's diagnostic breakthroughs. The contrast struck him with unexpected force. Printed certificates proclaiming his genius versus the raw, natural brilliance flowing from his son's mind. A mind that would have been extinguished if he'd continued following the expert consensus. Something broke inside Victor Reeves that night, not in the shattering way of grief, but in the transformative way that reshapes a person entirely. He sank into his chair, buried his face in his hands, and for the first time since childhood, sobbed without restraint. That's how Elise found him an hour later, The mighty Victor Reeves undone, vulnerable in a way she'd never witnessed. "He's going to live," Victor whispered, when he finally found his voice again. "Our son is going to live." Elise knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Yes, because you were willing to listen when it mattered most." Victor shook his head. "Not at first. I almost sent her away. If you hadn't intervened—" "But you did listen, eventually," Elise reminded him, "and that made all the difference." The transformation in Victor wasn't immediate, but it was profound. The man who had once dismissed Zara as the Maid now sought her input on Theo's development. The billionaire who had built his identity on academic credentials and scientific authority now questioned every assumption, every established protocol. 6 months after Theo's recovery began, Victor called a meeting in the penthouse living room. Gathered were Elise, Zara, and a team of attorneys. "I've made a decision," Victor announced without preamble. "I'm establishing the Theo Reeves Foundation with an initial endowment of $500 million. Elise gasped softly. Even the attorneys looked startled. "The foundation will have 3 missions," Victor continued. "First, funding research into metabolic interactions and genetic variants that transform standard treatments into toxins. Second, providing testing and alternative treatment protocols for families who can't afford them. And third," he turned to Zara, "creating a scholarship program for caregivers and non-traditional medical observers who demonstrate exceptional insight but lack financial means to complete their education." Zara's eyes widened. "Mr. Reeves?" "The first recipient," Victor said, sliding a folder across the table to her, "has already been selected. Full tuition at any medical school of your choice, plus living expenses and a stipend. You saved my son's life, Zara. It's time you had the credentials to match your brilliance." The power dynamic that had defined their relationship, billionaire employer and hired help, dissolved in that moment. In its place formed something rarer, genuine respect between equals. The following years brought changes no one could have predicted. The Foundation's work identified similar cases worldwide, children diagnosed with terminal conditions who actually suffered from treatable metabolic interactions. Hundreds of lives were saved. Medical protocols were revised. Research priorities shifted. Theo, now 8, continued to thrive. His autism remained, not something to be cured, but an integral part of who he was. His mathematical abilities proved exceptional, his mind approaching problems in ways that neurotypical children couldn't conceive. The tremors never returned. Zara completed accelerated pre-med studies and entered Harvard Medical School, focusing on integrative approaches to complex neurological conditions. Though no longer Theo's daily caregiver, she remained connected to the family, returning during breaks to observe his progress and update her original case study, which had been published in leading medical journals. Perhaps the most profound transformation, however, was in Victor himself. The man who had once judged value by credentials and wealth now evaluated people by different metrics: their capacity for observation, their willingness to question orthodoxy, their courage to stand firm when dismissed. On Theo's 9th birthday, 6 years after doctors had predicted he wouldn't live to see his 6th, the Reeves family hosted a celebration at their Hamptons estate. Among the guests were children from across the country who had been saved through protocols pioneered in Theo's case. As Victor watched his son leading other children in a complex game of his own invention, he felt Elise's hand slip into his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Victor gestured toward Zara, now in her 2nd year of medical school, deep in conversation with a leading neurologist who had once dismissed her theories. "I'm thinking about what we almost lost because of my arrogance, because I couldn't see value without the right pedigree attached." "You learned," Elise said simply. "Yes," Victor agreed. "And now others will too." Later that evening, as families prepared to leave, Victor found himself face to face with a father whose daughter had been saved through the Foundation's work. "How do you thank someone for your child's life?" the man asked, voice thick with emotion. Victor's gaze moved to Zara across the lawn, then to Theo beside her, both laughing at some shared joke. "You don't," he answered quietly. "You just make sure the gift keeps spreading." This story shows how one person's careful observation can change lives, even when that person doesn't have the right credentials or background. Sometimes the most important insights come from unexpected sources, and the courage to listen can make all the difference. Subscribe now to hear more incredible stories that might just change your perspective on who deserves to be heard. Boston Memorial Hospital's new pediatric research wing gleamed in the morning sunlight. The name, Theo Reeves Center for Integrative Medicine, etched in bronze above the entrance. Inside, doctors from around the world gathered for a landmark conference on genetic-metabolic interactions, a field that barely existed 5 years earlier. At the podium stood Dr. Zara Okafor, her white coat bearing Harvard Medical School's emblem, her research fellowship credentials displayed on the screen behind her. The audience sat rapt as she presented the latest findings. Over 3,000 children worldwide, once given terminal diagnoses, now thriving thanks to protocols pioneered in a single case that changed everything. "We've identified 14 distinct genetic variants that transform standard treatments into toxins," she explained. "Simple testing now prevents these tragic misdiagnoses. What was once considered a medical miracle is now standard protocol." In the front row, Victor and Elise Reeves listened with quiet pride. Beside them sat Theo, now 14, tall for his age and absorbed in a quantum physics textbook. The tremors had never returned. Though his autism remained part of who he was, he had grown into a remarkable young man whose mathematical theories were already drawing attention from leading universities. After the presentation, as attendees mingled during the reception, Theo approached Zara with the directness typical of his autism. "You look different in a doctor's coat," he observed, studying her carefully. Zara smiled. "Do you like it?" "Yes," he decided after consideration. "It suits you better than the blue uniform you wore when you first came to our house." Victor joined them, champagne flutes in hand. "To think I almost sent you away that day," he said, handing Zara a glass. "The world's leading expert on metabolic neurological interactions might never have completed her education. And a certain young mathematician might not be heading to MIT next fall," Zara added, nodding toward Theo, who had already been accepted to college 4 years early. The Theo Reeves Foundation had now helped over 50 caregivers and non-traditional observers complete medical training. Their unique perspectives had sparked breakthroughs across multiple fields, challenging entrenched thinking in everything from autism research to cancer treatment. "My grandmother would say that wisdom recognizes no credentials," Zara said softly. As the reception wound down, Victor found himself standing at the hospital's floor-to-ceiling windows, much like he had that desperate night 9 years ago when he'd received Theo's terminal diagnosis. The city stretched before him, but this time, instead of helpless despair, he felt profound gratitude. Elise appeared beside him, following his gaze. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How close we came to missing the truth," Victor replied. "How many experts it took to get it wrong, and how one person with clear eyes got it right." He watched as Theo and Zara sat together across the room, heads bent over a research paper. The once dying child and the once underestimated caregiver now colleagues in discovery. "The most valuable thing I've learned," Victor said, "is that true wisdom doesn't always come with degrees or wealth. Sometimes it arrives in worn-out shoes, carrying nothing but open eyes, and the courage to speak truth when no one wants to hear it."